Welcome to Primal Perspective at the Primal Lab. My name is Ben Sanford, and I'll be your guide today. In this series, I'm having conversations with my friends, colleagues, and teachers who have valuable and unique perspectives to share with the world. By exploring things from a primal perspective, we reveal the principles, the processes, and patterns of nature, which enhance any practice and can give us insight into our lives. This month in our core curriculum, our focus is on a class called The Tools, which is all about the tools of nature connection or human nature connection. And I had the pleasure of having a conversation with my friend Nate Summers, who wrote the book Primal, and who has been a practitioner and teacher of nature connection and many other skills for many years. And we had a great time, and I look forward to sharing this with you. And now, Nate Summers. So welcome, and thank you, Nate, for joining me today on our interview at Primal Perspective. Really good to have you.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. It's my pleasure. Always a pleasure to connect with you. And yeah, I'm excited to connect with what you're doing and share a little bit here today.
Right on. So the intention of this series, just real quick, and this is really cool for me because you're obviously familiar with the theme, and in a couple of ways. First of all, you wrote a book called Primal, and you'd like to talk about that a little bit. And so the intention of the conversation, though, is to take these different subjects that we focus on at Tribal Edge and to get down to the primal core of them, basically, to look at the primal, meaning the essential, original, fundamental kind of core essence of things. And so what that seems to lead to is it kind of revealing the principles and the processes and the patterns that drive the expression of these different arts and different things that we're looking at. So today we're focusing on the tools of, our class is called The Tools, but it's basically the tools of nature connection. And I look at it as like human nature transformation, because we are nature. So that's the direction we're going at. And so with all of your experience with, a lot of the core techniques or the core tools that I use and that we use in our training, I got mostly through, well, originally maybe Tom Brown, but also through Wilderness Awareness School. And while you were there, so you were one of my instructors there. And so you have a lot of background with this stuff. So I'm really excited to be able to pick your brain on it.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Ben. And it's a true pleasure and honor to connect with you and the work you're doing and to be here today. And also just honoring that we come from basically the same lineage and have had the same teachers, and how lucky we are. And that, hopefully our conversation isn't too redundant, but yeah, like we kind of speak the same language. And I know when I interviewed you for my book Primal, about the work you do at Tribal Edge and everything, it was very easy. It was one of those few like interviews where it's just like, I mean, a lot of the interviews were actually easy and enjoyable, but especially with you, it was like we were speaking the same language. And I was, in that case, we were talking about movement primarily, right? And so that's another place where we have a huge overlap, a lot of the same teachers, same lineage, and then our own little development and fruition of that in slightly different places. But you live out on the Olympic Peninsula. I live over here on the, just west of the Cascades, with similar bioregions. So it's just fun to talk with people who, and talk shop, talk about this work, so.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, let's start with, for the folks that may not know you, I really want to get your stuff out there more. And can you just kind of give us a background of your relationship to nature connection skills, or nature awareness, whatever you want to call it, human nature connection? I don't know what even they're calling it these days, but
I mean, the terminology is a little tricky because there's a lot of people out there who do nature connection work of various kinds. But I think what, you and I have noticed that there's a deeper level that we're often talking about, and that word primal kind of captures that. That's one of the reasons, I know you use that word, it's why I use that word. But yeah, I grew up in the Midwest, kind of in the era of before there was a lot of like TV and internet and all that stuff. I mean, there was TV, but there's like 3 or 4 channels, and like that was about it. And there, there's Saturday morning cartoons, but there wasn't like 500 channels or instant Netflix, binge watch all this stuff. So, and I was, raised by a single mom for especially the first 5 to 8 years of my life, and I was kicked outside a lot. And I did not have like a raw wilderness area to go play in it. Like where I live in Washington, there's a lot more intact nature, but I did go out and play near a pond, in some meadows, barefoot with other kids my age, especially other boys, playing with sticks and rocks and catching fish barehanded and getting muddy, and the kind of thing that, used to be a pretty common part of the American life, and going back further, the more indigenous life that we all had with those ancestral ways. And so, but I went to public school. I wasn't homeschooled or any of that kind of stuff. But then when I was 13, I had an opportunity to go to a camp, and I was being led by one of my history teachers at school, in middle school, and this camp was called an archaeology camp. And I just love this teacher. I love what he did. He was the kind of teacher, like when he was teaching us prehistory, which we actually learned about in school, he would bring in stone, and he did flint knapping in front of us in the classroom. So pretty amazing teacher. His name is Chris Butler. He's still teaching. He's just on the verge of retirement, but so he took us down to this place, and it was called the Ancient Lifeways Institute. And looking back, I really just reflect on how lucky I was to go to a place like this. It was very, it was special. It was unique. It was one of a kind at the time. It was a Stone Age immersion camp run by this man, John White, whose traditional name was Five Bears. And he was part Cherokee, mixed Scots descent, but, he had lived a traditional lifestyle. And him and his sons ran this camp where we'd walk through riverbeds and gather stone and make stone tools, and we'd dig clay from the earth and then build a kiln and fire pottery. And we lived in like long houses for the week. It was just this sort of a unbelievable cultural and physical immersion. And this all happened when I was a teenager, and I kept going back to this place every summer. And, that does something to your brain to get exposed to that, especially at that age, and kind of, I like to think of it as it opens things up, but it also especially it helps things not shut down that tend to be shut down in kids as they grow older. And so later when I went to college and I got done with college, I really quickly fell into the world of outdoor education, environmental education, and eventually ended up at the Wilderness Awareness School, where I was an instructor on and off for quite a few years, teaching things like tracking and ethnobotany, natural movement, survival skills, but all through this lens of really having a heavy piece of culture woven into it, which I know you're probably emphasize that in your programs, and we've talked and worked on that together. In fact, we did some art of mentorings together way back in the day, both in Hawaii and in California. So
yeah. One of my favorite experiences. Yeah. Cool. So let's back up to primal real quick, just because again that's an important word for you, obviously, and it's something that it took me a while to in building Tribal Edge or discovering Tribal Edge. I like to think of it as rediscovering something. Primal just kind of came through as a really core concept. So what does that mean to you? The word.
Yeah, I liked what you were mentioning earlier, the idea of original and essential. And for me, I found this, a lot through what people would call survival skills or traditional living skills. But I've also found it through my own studies of, internal martial arts and other things, that there's this part of our human nature, it's this original nature that somehow gets obscured by the busyness of our modern civilization and technology. And that when we drop into that aspect of who we are, we just tend to get like healthier and happier, more emotionally connected, more connected to other people, and feel more fulfilled. And it's almost like and I don't know, I mean, I have ideas about this, but I don't know exactly why it is that our society kind of teaches us or guides us to like want and desire certain things that are ultimately not very fulfilling. And if we can figure out what is fulfilling, we enjoy life a lot more. And I think we can actually create a healthier civilization, a healthier society. I remember when I was writing Primal, my book that came out from Falcon last fall, I had just finished the first full draft. The first 50% was really pretty well crafted, and the second 50% I was just about done with. And I was at this Russian bathhouse in Seattle, and I ran into this guy, and it was just kind of around the holidays, and people were pretty chatty and stuff. We'd just done some steams, and it felt really good. And there was this man he'd worked in like advertising for over 40 years. And, he was hearing about the premise of my book, that basically, we're hunter-gatherers at our heart. We're hunter-gatherers at our brain level, and that the world around us doesn't match that. And if we learn to like match those needs, kind of hack that system, we are actually, more happy and healthy and stuff. And he was like, oh yeah, he this man who'd been in traditional advertising, he quit advertising in like his late 50s, early 60s, because he was just like, he'd seen so many people go through exactly what I'm talking about, like go through the traditional hoops and keep jumping through these hoops, and then ultimately end up very unfulfilled. Even though they were very materially successful, there was just this emptiness inside of them and this pain. And he was actually going to start working with people to work on that issue, that lack of fulfillment for these people who had experienced a lot of what we would call material success. So, and I think that those primal desires, those primal needs, are not that complicated. I mean, they're fun and they're deep and rich and sophisticated, but they're not super complicated.
Right. Yeah. Very accessible. Right below the surface.
Yeah.
Awesome. So getting back to, I guess, the tools concept. So in our curriculum, this is what we're looking at is, I guess, really more accurately might be called practices, Mm-hmm. So these are some things, for example, that we use are stuff like, the sit spot, the Thanksgiving address, all the core routines that you're familiar with. But what I'm exploring is, for one, just getting your perspective on them, but also kind of getting a little deeper into why these tools are so powerful. What is it that's happening when we engage in these practices, and also when they start to compound together, something seems to happen too. So I mean, if you do, well, maybe we'll just start with what are some of the key tools that you think of in terms of nature connection or human nature connection. What's important to you there?
Yeah. Well, it's sort of like there's a list of about 20 core routines that we can dive into, and then within that list there's maybe 5 or 6 that are like the core routines or whatever. And in the classes I've been teaching recently, one of the things that's pretty stunning is that people around the world in this time of the COVID shutdown or like social distancing or whatever, how important these tools have become to give people a sense of peace, relaxation, and I think people also finding ways of connecting that they didn't realize they could do, because they were sort of like all of us wrapped up in the busyness of modern life, that they didn't really need to do all that to feel maybe fulfilled in certain ways. So some of the main core routines would be the sit spot is always my one of my favorites. Like I go back to that, just like that time sitting by yourself alone in nature. And I find that, I've done that practice on and off for, over 20 years. And if I don't do it, I can tell, because I get more stressed and I get more frustrated. I'm probably not as fun a person or an easy as a person to be around, but it just really regulates my nervous system. But I think it just goes back to, like, this was something humans did for thousands, probably tens of thousands of years as a regular practice. There's a native activist and teacher here in the Seattle area named Paul Wagner. His traditional name is Chiokuten. And I heard him talking about traditional Northwest tribal culture. And he said, everybody was always together except when they would go do this practice. And he described the sit spot. Like,
no kidding.
And I was just like, wow, like, I'm pretty sure he's not heard of the lineage I'm a part of, but he was describing sit spot, this time where you just go. And the best times of day are dusk and dawn, but you can do it anytime, and it's great to do it throughout the whole year,
Yeah.
The sit spot is one of the main ones. The gratitude, the Thanksgiving address, like, just, really getting into, like, wow, like, how grateful you are for what you have. And, we could go down a little rabbit hole here that maybe if you'd like to, we can go down that, but it's around, I think, related to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that somehow we think we need a lot more than we need. And if we can actually pause and just be like, wow, like, there's a whole world around me of plants and trees and animals that are thriving, and I'm thankful for them. And I have enough to eat. I have a roof over my head. I have water. Getting those survival needs are actually taken care of. I should be grateful for that. Like, I'm succeeding as a human being with I have those things. And it just seems like we're taught that that's never enough, and that we need to be constantly doing a lot of other things. Deep sensory awareness, like, that is another one, like going in and just, like, really activating your senses and, noticing that our senses, my understanding of it, having seen a lot of different people over the years and interviewed people and written about this now, is that our senses are designed for this kind of environment, right? Like, and when we get this environment, it's very soothing and healing and healthy for us. So that deep sensory awareness, bird language being a part of that, like listening to the birds, because it's something we can really tune into almost everywhere. Even in a very urban setting, there are birds around, and they're very adaptable. Just a couple more, some sort of movement practice, like, moving your body in ways that you don't normally move them when you're, like, at a computer, or, I've been doing, I'm doing this typing all day, and it's like I've been in this kind of square frame. It's like expanding and moving my body in different ways from that, often in some sort of wild manner. And then I guess the last core routine, and again, we could talk about all 20 or so if we wanted to, would be some sort of connection to survival, what people call survival skills, like tapping into a relationship with your food, warmth, fire, water, and shelter that you're directly connected to, as opposed to disconnected to. I feel like that's the essentials. And just a real quick little anecdote, a little story about that is, there's a blueberry farm that's it's basically sort of a blueberry farm that was turned into a park. So it's like free blueberries for everybody, right? You can just go and pick blueberries. And I've gone there the last couple summers with my men's group, and we've done blueberry picking. And I took my wife and son there. My son's only like 2.5. And we picked blueberries for about a couple hours the other night. We've made a cobbler from that. We've made smoothies from that. And just that interaction with food is so nourishing to people. And part of it is the taste of those wild berries. Like, they're really, really good, right? But the experience itself of being directly interacting with your food, like that's something that I think humans are missing in a real fundamental way. So
Yeah, no, that's a really cool one, actually. That's I hadn't actually thought of it as a core routine that way. I like that. Yeah, that seems very very grounding. So what let's just look at some of the why, perhaps, of what are these routines that you mentioned, and especially, I keep coming back to, in my experience, when you layer these on top of each other and start to kind of compound them, they kind of have another effect as well. Something else kind of emerges. It might be the primal self in a way, but so why are they important, and what's happening to you developmentally? What's going on when you're practicing these things?
yeah, well, these days I always say yes to podcasts. Like when somebody asks me to do a podcast or an interview or something, I say yes, because back a couple years ago, I got invited by my friend Ted Alvarez to do a podcast with him. And that conversation, that podcast led directly into me getting the contract to write my book Primal.
Oh, cool.
And it was because we had a conversation like you and I are having today, and we were talking about how, if we're biologically designed to be hunter-gatherers, like if we've spent hundreds of thousands of years biologically that way, and our biology hasn't actually shifted that much, and we learned to tap into that, or our society isn't tapping into that, that's a big conundrum for all of us. And I said to Ted, Ted, man, somebody should write a book about that. And like literally at the end of our conversation. And he was like, Nate, you should write a book about that. And I was like, me? No way. Like that sounds way too complicated. He's like, no, really, like you've been doing this, you have the connections to people in the field, you should write about this. And so, but the premise is really there that, it's like, okay, we're talking about biology and neurology now. And I remember, and I'm sure you remember, Ben, like 20 plus years ago when we were doing this, or 15 years ago even, there wasn't a lot of research out on this. It was like, there was sort of this intuitive sense from some homeschool families that, yeah, it's good for my kids to be in nature, or I think it's good for them. And now it's like, with Richard Louv's work and some other people's work, it's exploded. There's all this scientific research that shows your brain really benefits from this, but nobody's talking about the why, like you're kind of getting at, like nobody actually explains, well, the reason why our brain does so well with nature and with these primal skills and things is because actually we evolved over tens of thousands of years to do these things. And so our biology expects it. Like I really do think like we expect to like break rocks with our hands, my wife and I were teaching a class yesterday on big rock training, like lifting rocks, like some of like the Earth Gym McDodge stuff, and I was talking to them like the computer we're actually looking at right now came from rocks. And people were kind of like, what? And I was like, no, the first tools were rocks. So every other tool that's ever come since then is related to our first rock technology. So when I get people out there, and I'm not a good plant number. My skill is very modest, but I know how to teach people to break rocks and get a little like stone knife that they can then like make a fireboard with. And people go bananas with that. They're just like, this is so amazing. I can make a stone knife, and they like strut around. And so really what we're doing is we're tapping into that inner hunter-gatherer inside of us. And that suddenly shifts people's priorities around like what they think is really important in a pretty powerful way. And I think for some people, the older they are, it can be a little disconcerting. Like I think you and I have seen sometimes people, the Tractor School or Wilderness Learning School or some of these programs enter into this immersive program, and there's almost this cognitive dissonance that happens where they're like, oh my gosh, my whole life I've been doing all this other stuff, and it's not very important. What's really important is tracking, like I bet, and tracking's another good one to like, you know, this is not my original idea, but I would like to like do some more research and write about this as well. And I think Louis Liebenberg might have been the first person to talk about this, but there's pretty compelling evidence that tracking wild animals led to the first forms of symbolic thought, because you would look at a track and your brain made the connection between that footprint and an animal. And the first form of written language was probably people sketching animal tracks to tell each other what they had seen. And so we're talking about the fundamental level of like human language development, and symbolic language development relates to these things. So I was talking to somebody a few months ago who's a landscape design person about my book, and he was talking to me about biochar and all this stuff about how to like replenish the soil. And he was hearing the premise. He's like, yeah, it's like once you start to peel that back, you suddenly see this everywhere. And he was talking about his wife and the birth of their 2 children, and the idea of like, yeah, for like tens of thousands and thousands and thousands of years, women gave birth in villages without hospitals, and that doesn't mean that what wasn't sometimes complicated, and we all make our choices around that, but to realize that these primal things are there everywhere, and when we unlock them, it's like there's a lot of opportunity for us, I think. And yeah, I think the other way to consider it is there might be opportunities for us on a societal level to reconsider what we're doing and why and how, and maybe we could redesign some of the ways we do things in our world that might be more beneficial for humans, but it might also be more beneficial for all of this, more beneficial for the chickadees that just flew in and are chatting above me,
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, it's really the point you made on this being potentially where we developed kind of this symbolic thinking, or even our second order thinking, metacognition, the ability to kind of think about our thinking and reflect, possibly came from tracking. I'm actually talking to John Vervaeke about that, a cognitive scientist, and kind of looking into that a little more, as I'm very curious on that myself. So you're tapping into kind of where I was leading with that question, was like the relevance of these skills today, besides the why biologically and evolutionarily, but the relevance in our society and culture. I think I'm not sure where I got this phrase. It might have been through John Young, but the idea of separation sickness, this fundamental illness or pandemic that we're all suffering from, and how these skills can start to be the healing context for that. So do you have anything else to say about how they are relevant to the modern human? Or you kind of did cover that, but if there's anything that...
Well, yeah, I guess there's 2 other little things I'll say. One is that the way that the editors and the people I was working with at Falcon got really behind the project for writing the book Primal was when I started to show them data about how, as we've gotten more and more technologically focused with screens and screen time and smartphones, interest in survival skills and survival skills training has exploded. And you see this in like TV shows, you see this in like YouTube videos, and you have this weird intermingling now of like what we're doing right now, screen technology and this kind of primal training. So it is still really relevant and interesting for people. And perhaps as we get further divorced from reality, the more there's some longing to go back to that reality. And yeah, and in the COVID times, I've found that a lot of people were really stressed and really anxious and really having a hard time. And then when they realized they could go outside and connect to nature, and tap into those quieter parts of themselves, it was really soothing. And then I guess the last thing I'll say about it, which I'm very curious about, this is the kind of thing that came out in the writing of my book and in interviews and talking about it since, is that, you know, as I understand like some of the ideas behind therapy, like psychological therapy, talk therapy, it's that there's these unconscious things that are affecting us, right? And they kind of interfere with our life on a daily basis. These beliefs maybe we have from childhood, or wounds we have, and we're not really aware of them. And they cause us to act in certain ways that can be kind of dysfunctional. And then through the process of therapy, those unconscious things become conscious. And so then we can make different choices about how we live and what we do. So if we're all have these deep unconscious desires around, you know, say sitting around a fire with other people, or being involved with our food, or just unstructured time in nature, or a lot of sensory time in nature, and we're not getting those, then that's affecting us both as individuals and as a society. So I really feel like the opportunity now is to bring these unconscious needs and desires forward to a conscious level, where we can redesign our lives individually, but also societally. Like, we could really create a different world that's a lot less consumption based, I think.
That's really cool. Yeah. And that therapeutic process you're talking about would naturally be extended by these practices themselves. I mean, as we unconsciously are drawn to the fire, the practice of sitting by the fire or sit spot kind of naturally leads to a insight into yourself as well. So
yeah,
even more healing. So cool. Yeah. So see if this is if you we can slightly distinguish this question. How are these practices, how do you see them being met today in our modern world? That, you know, like you said, we both have kind of this pathway of learning them specifically in a specific way, but how do you kind of see them kind of coming in through the cracks in other forms, or maybe through other pathways, even in a modern context? What's emerging that's showing symptoms for the need of this?
Yeah, well, the whole explosion in interest in fitness over the last 10 years around CrossFit and mobility and these kinds of things are very interesting to me, and that there's really an overlap with that, with the more wild, natural, movement-based stuff. Parkour is another one where you can kind of just see it, like people desiring to move their bodies in very different ways. And it's funny to see, like, okay, people developing parkour in these very urban settings, and then like a different set of practices that you and I are familiar with and been, you know, taught, like around animal-based movement, and like they're like 90% of the practices are the same. So again, it's sort of this fundamental human relationship that's showing up in interesting ways. And you know, CrossFit, the same thing. It's like, you know, the diversity of movement training, like varying your intensity, varying the objects you lift or pick up or move. And I even found, like, in the years before I was writing Primal, you know, the explosion of interest in the paleo diet, and which is now often kind of more the keto diet. But people, you know, I had all these people who were like, oh yeah, I'm really into paleo. So they were eating a very specific way, and they were doing a lot of CrossFit, and like but they didn't know how to make a fire, you know? It's like, hey, there's another piece here. There's this whole other side of this. Like, you're tapping into this primal need, these primal human things, but there's a lot more you could add to it that would really help. I think there's been more interest in foraging, and there's just been a general, you know, explosion in people going more outdoors, which has been really healthy in some ways. I think we could all work a little bit on not just using the outdoors as our gym to move through. Right. And I think I heard you describe this too, but to move with, right? Yeah. Move with the landscape and the objects in the landscape and the living beings, the trees and the things in the landscape. And then, yeah, there are some interesting things too about how you and I talked about this, the sort of more negative way these things come out is some of the acts around violence, especially men in violence, you know, shootings that happen at schools, shootings that happen in places, this lack of a real outlet for the sort of primal masculine desire to be a protector and even to hunt, perhaps to go through some sort of rite of passage related to killing and death, and how that's not there, then it kind of goes out in this, comes out in this weird way. Yeah.
It's huge. Wow. Yeah. Boy, that's a whole nother cool conversation right there. You know, a couple other areas that I've noticed, I would say, is kind of the rise of mindfulness training. It seems like there's, right, is another one. And, you know, all of this kind of actually what you mentioned brings us to, I feel like we're touching on a principle here of nature connection, which you mentioned, maybe with that distinction of moving with instead of through, you know. There's some sort of, what seems to be missing from the really cool movements that are arising. Still, it reminds me of when you see an indoor pet versus an outdoor pet, you know, you have this like animal that goes outside and it's like, okay, what, how does this work? You know, there's still a matter of familiarity or maybe connection or even respect through empathy of the wild that is reflected back to our own wild within ourselves. There's that gap is, you know, seems to be with the nature connection practices seems to be, you know, a big part of what that's perhaps bridging. But
yeah.
Do you see any other like primal principles that are important to think of in practicing nature connection or, you know, moving in that direction? What's and by principle I mean, you know, something that's like a constant through all of the skills or all the practices, something that's kind of universally useful or true.
Yeah, well, I think there's two things that come to mind. One is that you know, I've done a fair amount of traditional, you know, Eastern Asian meditation training. Sitting and standing meditations, a lot of Qigong training, a lot of internal martial arts training. And, you know, I've heard Tom Brown and John Young talk about this idea that where those practices take you, you can get to very quickly through nature connection. This sort of stillness, this sort of internal, like what Gilbert used to talk about, Gilbert Walking will talk about is the sacred silence or the quiet mind. And at first I was a little skeptical of that, having spent a lot of time doing that in other places. And I'm not going to say that one is better or easier or anything than the other, but I have found that that's true, that people can get there a lot quicker than they think they can. And there's this idea that you can sort of get to, it's like you can, I mean, I want to say this in as respectful a way as possible, but it's sort of this idea that you can get through 10 years of daily meditation, sitting meditation practice, like in a week of nature immersion or something like that. I mean, it's not quite right, but and I've seen that happen. I've had that happen, you know, these like experiences where you're in nature and like your mind just goes away for extended periods of time, that is these like very exalted levels of training in a different paradigm of like, oh yeah, after decades of sitting, you might have this. And like, we just went tracking with wolves. I mean, you were on some of those wolf tracking trips where you're tracking wolves all day, like 5 days in a row. And then you go do a sit spot at the end of the day and just, your mind is gone for like 90 minutes. And you're in like a state very similar to, if not the same, of what's called samadhi, you know, from Eastern tradition. So this principle of the quiet mind and or the sacred silence. So that would be like one of those core principles, and that I find it also with the like the wild movement is another place I find that it's like that thinking mind, which may or may not have evolved, like we're talking about from these same things, goes away, and eventually, I don't know how long it actually takes. It's probably different from different people, but you learn to consciously shut it off. It's like you can turn it off at will by coming into your senses, especially in a natural setting, especially if you do the sit spot regularly, you do those sensory integration or sensory awareness practices regularly. You do fox walking, it's just like that sacred silence comes up. So that would be one of the practices. And I think that's super important for all of us to have that in our lives and to realize like maybe that's fundamental to being human. And if we all had that more, how might that change our relationships with each other in the world? And should we be, designing the world that way? The second thing is, it's kind of like I was mentioning before with the blueberries, but taking it deeper that, the kind of thing that actually happens for people when they take the life of an animal for the first time and they consume that animal, and they eat it, and especially if they like are involved, especially if they hunt it or they catch it, even fish, I think that I'm more of a fishing person than a hunting person, but like I just still have very clear remembrance of the first time I caught a big salmon and I took its life and I cooked it, I cleaned it and I cooked it and like ate it, and that empathy, that reverence for life, that appreciation for life that we're missing on a daily basis when we eat, 3 times a day with not being related to our food, where our food is, we go and get it at the grocery store and just bring it home and cook it, or we don't even cook it, we just get it at the restaurant. I think there's something about that appreciation and reverence for life that comes about from these things, and you can get there different ways. Like you can get there, let's say you have a cold or a flu, or you're getting over COVID, and like somebody gives you that herbal tea made from Douglas fir needles, and you inhale that steam and it goes in and soothes your lungs, and you drink that tea, and you can breathe, like your chest literally opens up a little bit more. It's like that reverence for life comes out, that of like, wow, like the world around me is amazing and I'm lucky to be alive, and there's a ton of amazing things that I can interact with, and to interact with them in that way is the natural way,
Yeah, that's cool. So I'm hearing the sacred silence or the quiet mind, some sort of access to that, and then this sense of fitting and belonging through immersion, or through I guess sacredness, through that respect of life, which is huge. Also, by the way, I think that one can be accessed through martial art training, right?
Yes.
Through ethical martial art training, you have the realization of, oh wow, now life is in my hands, and it's, so to speak. So yeah. What was the other one? I was thinking of one that comes to mind for me is seems to be a consistent theme or principle in nature connection is slowing down.
Oh yeah.
Or even being still. Being quiet and kind of matching. I guess we live in this pace that's really hard to detect when we're just in it, and it can feel normal. But when you go out, either camping for a few days or some sort of maybe questing or something, there's just another pace that emerges, right? That's I don't know if it's just based on a metabolic need or if it's just the pace of the earth. And when we tap into that, seems like a lot of these things are more accessible too.
Yeah, and my understanding from time spent with indigenous teachers, or sometimes in indigenous cultures, or even in like a retreat setting, a nature retreat setting of some sort, that pace is actually probably the normal
Yeah.
human pace.
Basically.
And all the stuff we're doing the rest of the time is actually pretty frantic and pretty hard on us, pretty stressful. And that if we could actually remember that the normal human pace is like way slower, and that if you're living at that frantic pace, if you're doing that in nature, you hurt yourself. Like you stub your toe, or you get scratched by the blackberries, or whatever. Like you get a stick in the face. You know, like you can't do it because you get hurt, or you twist your ankle, or you can't catch the fish, or you miss the berries because you're just like hiking right past them. So yeah, that's a great one.
Yeah, you know, and that's really cool because the nature, I don't even like to use the word nature because we are nature, but you know, the wild, we'll call it, gives you the feedback directly if you're not in alignment with it, whether it be the bird language or everything running away from you, or the stick in the face and all that stuff. So yeah, the feedback is there as to whether or not you are matching the pace and the flow. That's another one, is flow state. Seems like all of these things, perhaps one of the emergent qualities that comes from these practices is some sort of flow state, you know, which is two things. It's our optimal state for functioning, but it's also where we perform the best too. You know, so and it's highly addictive. I think we're all after that. That's why we do stuff like rock climbing and tree climbing and you know, even meditation.
Yeah.
Let's see. So how does one begin to learn some of these skills? Like what's, you know, if someone's just watching this or doesn't have access to training with someone, like how can they, what would you tell someone? I'll just jump to this question. I like it. Is if you could only teach someone one principle, concept, tool for nature connection, what would it be? I think I have a guess, but go ahead.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I'm going to kind of fudge my answer sheet a little bit because it's difficult, but I think that finding ways to be comfortable alone in nature and allowing your senses to be activated. So that's kind of two, but it's one practice as I was taught it, and I'm sure as you were taught it, but it is that thing of like, wow, like I've had amazing sit spot experiences in the city. I used to live in the city of Seattle, you know, and I know Seattle's kind of a different city in that there are a lot of wild natural places, but you know, Tom Brown talks about this in some of his books, and a lot of other people talk about the urban wildlife that's out there. Peregrine falcons diving off of buildings, raccoons traveling through, you know, knocking over garbage cans. So regardless of where you are, there was some guy, I was hearing his story, he was in South Africa, and they were quarantined there. They were really quarantined. They couldn't leave their like apartments like for some period of time, for weeks. And he was a diver who was used to, like, his deep nature connection was all related to being out in the ocean and swimming. And so he would just have to go out on his porch, his little, you know, what they call in Hawaii, like the lanai or whatever. Like he'd go out on his little porch on the like second or third floor in his apartment, and like have to just like watch the wind and the sun and the clouds and see what birds he noticed. So even within that like confined to context, he was able to find a way to get into his senses and find that stillness. And so I think that would be the place to start for people, you know. And I had several people talk to me that, and actually in another podcast talk about with some friends who are naturopaths, how so many of the people they were working with were experiencing a lot of stress around the lockdown and the social isolation, that they found that if they could go outside for a few minutes every day and just connect with the tree, that it was really healing for that need, that sense of isolation and stress. So I guess that would be my most, like, if they could only do one. And I think that in this interesting world we're in, there are a lot of resources available, you know, books and videos and online courses now, like what you're doing, you know, is exactly, you know, the strange paradox of it. Suddenly we're reaching more people all over the world with this in some ways than we were with the in-person stuff we were doing just 6 months ago.
Yeah. Yeah. So with that simple prescription of a practice, what would be the, how does someone know that they're attaining nature connection? Like what are the symptoms of nature connection or of being connected? And maybe we even need to kind of look at what does connection mean, you know?
Yeah. Well, I do think that probably the most fundamental one, and again, this is something that you hear people talk about, is this very exalted place you get to after years and years of spiritual cultivation. But I do think is actually, instead of that, is actually the fundamental human relationship, is that you realize that, I mean, it's sort of implied in the term nature connection, but it's realized you are connected to everything. Like, you're mutually interdependent with everything. And that actually, it's like the oxygen put off by the plants and the carbon dioxide we breathe out, or the sense of like the sunlight that comes down and transforms into these plants. Like, that's no longer an intellectual thing, right? It's like nature connection is like experiencing that as like, oh yeah, we are all connected. Or, you know, you hear it sometimes in indigenous cultures, we are all related, right? We're all of our relations like are all together. And so there's a sense of finding that pretty quickly, not in like this, like, oh my gosh, like I did, you know, a whole bunch of training with a spiritual teacher, and then I did like many retreats, or I did like a whole bunch of vision quests or whatever, and I had this vision of I was one with everything. It's like you actually experience being one with everything pretty regularly, because that's kind of how it is, you know.
Yeah. That's so cool. I mean, yeah, what I'm hearing, and from my own experience, kind of what happened or happens for me, is a sense of maybe realizing that the boundaries we impose on the world become kind of arbitrary, or seem for what they are, as kind of illusory, you know? It's like, not that there aren't things out there and stuff, but it's like you start to see things in terms of process, maybe, and in terms of cycle and flows and networks, you know? So it's kind of that right brain opening, perhaps, or systems thinking kind of shows up. That can really dissolve some of those edges pretty fast.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And there was some research I did for my book, and I read, I can't remember the author's name, but there's a couple authors who have spoken about this, that they really believe that the hunter-gatherer, indigenous, nature-connected person, and I'm not talking like you're like full-on hunter-gatherer like all the time, but that is one example of it, that you actually spent more or most of your time in that right brain state of awareness, because you needed to be aware of predators, say, or to hunt, or to fish successfully, or to gather food successfully. And I heard this in the context of people who were still reindeer herders, some of the Sami people, that they just like to protect the reindeer from wolves, you know, as in a nomadic pattern, like they just had to spend a lot of time in that right brain part of their psyche, and they seemed very at peace, you know. And so that's maybe not as far away and hard to access as maybe we think. Yeah. And maybe it's natural, like, again, like coming back to these are all natural things. And I just want to put out a caveat too, because like sometimes when I talk about this, like people think like I live in a longhouse out in the woods and I'm, gathering all of my salmon and I'm smoking it and I just live completely off grid, and it's not the case. Like, most of my work happens through a computer now these days. Like I have to remind myself of this every day. And like I, need to go out, and every time I go out, it's like, it's not like I instantly slow down and I just go vroom, into like this Zen state. It's like I have to, still consciously like slow down and like drop into those places and find those places through sit spot or box walking or, doing some bagua, walking in a circle around a tree. But they're available to me and they're available to all of us. And the way we might most easily access that might be different for everybody. It might be based off of our personality or our personal history too, which is why it's nice that there's so many options.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in terms of connection, what you mentioned there with the right brain activation, and as Tom Brown taught that, and you guys taught that as well, one of the simplest accesses to that is the wide angle vision. It's just, it literally takes you out of kind of the tunnel vision, more left brain focused. It's used to dealing with known, and then going into wide angle, kind of available to uncertainty, and all of that. So cool. So yeah, that might be another kind of principle of connection, actually. So let's see. What do you think people don't get about what we're talking about nature connection, about these tools? I'm just throwing out weird questions.
Yeah, well, I think this is one of the things that I remember came up in our conversation when I interviewed you for Primal was I think you called it this idea that everybody was just suffering for years and years and years and years, for thousands of years, because it was so hard to exist and it was so miserable. The idea that somehow previous human societies, without all the comforts of modernity, is just horrible and terrible. I mean, you actually find this, and I have to be careful about how I say this because I want to be respectful, but I've had a lot of people talk to me about how when they go to other parts of the world that are less materially comfortable, what some people would live in a state of poverty, the people and the children both seem happier than the people in this country. Yeah. So this idea that like we're happier the more divorced we are from our basic needs, this comes back to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or that oh my gosh, to be a hunter-gatherer, it must have been so hard. Like people used to have to work so hard, and it's actually the opposite. It's and there's really well documented stories of this. If you go and look at it, like the average hunter-gatherer culture had all of their needs met, their material needs met, like by putting in about 15 to 20 hours a week or less, even in the harshest climates. And so that meant the rest of their time was devoted to family, culture, spirituality, art, song, dance, like all of these things, people had plenty of time for it. Now, did that mean that there wasn't any hardship? No, there was tons of hardship that people would face. Environmental changes, disease, a lack of food sometimes. But even that, it's like we say, oh, like lack of food. Well, we're now finding out that actually our metabolism is designed to have fasting periods. The reason intermittent fasting, I believe, is successful as a dietary practice is because we weren't successful all the time hunting and gathering. Like there were always gaps. And so I remember talking to some friends about this not that long ago, who the naturopath friends, they were talking about like most religious traditions have a period of fasting that's part of their religious practice that I believe is a remembrance of the fact that there were times when we didn't have food all the time, and that our metabolism is actually designed to have these breaks in food, and it's really good for our body. Like they're talking about like now, like you live longer, like it completely resets, aspects of your your genes at the genetic level. And so there's this notion that that was all terrible and hard and suffering. And the reality is, you know, yes, I think there were hard times. Yes, I think there was violence between people sometimes. But the story that you know, and I don't want to like have sort of it's a golden age, but I think that it's actually way different than we think. And almost everybody I've ever taken on that journey over, you know, 20 plus years of teaching people of all ages, they get some deep sense of well-being and healing and wholeness from doing those things, at least temporarily, you know. But and the just to also echo the indigenous teachers I've run into around these things, they say like, yeah, like people loved living that way. It didn't mean that there wasn't a hard times, and you know, children that died before the age of 2, that like that was actually pretty common. Like people don't realize the infant mortality rate was a lot higher. And so, you know, a family might have like 5 or 6 kids and only 2 of them make it. But, you know, what's the other side of that, where we're now facing, you know, serious population issues on the planet, like that we can't feed everybody. So yeah, I guess that would be the biggest myth, the biggest fallacy that I would want people to really do their own research on and really examine, is like, how much work did it take to live that way? And what were the people's lives really like? And what was the world like around them? Because where I live, you know, here in traditional Snoqualmie territory, like, you know, the Snoqualmie River's right over there to the west, and the Tolt River's right over there to the south, and their convergence is right over there. Those rivers 5 or 6 times a year were filled with different runs of salmon that were so thick you couldn't really walk, but it was like you could walk across the river. Like,
Yeah,
and you could, yeah, they're slippery, but you could haul the fish out really relatively easily, and then you just smoked that salmon and you had enough food for the winter. It was not, I think it's different than people think. And the ecologically, things were a lot healthier. I mean, there's no denying that. There's like really compelling evidence that there was way more biodiversity, and there was much higher numbers of animals, and there was a lot like healthier, intact ecosystems. So
yeah, for sure. Man, I had a thought on that and I lost it.
Mm.
What has been, for you personally, what's been your biggest challenge with nature connection? Start with you just personally on your own path, but also in teaching it.
Yeah, well, there's this thing I was talking. There's a part in Primal. It's towards the end of it where I talk about how, like, all of the survival skills instructors I know, the people who teach this nature connection work, everybody I know is on Facebook and Instagram and has to have an online presence. It's like, it's a modern survival skill. It's like you have to have a different set of survival skills, you know? Mm-hmm. And I was even like, some of my students were really pushing me to get online and start teaching. And I was pretty reluctant, you know, and COVID kind of pushed me over the edge to actually start doing it. But in the midst of that, like, you know, one of my students was like, well, why would you teach online, Nate? And I was like, well, if you look at it, like Tom Brown and John Young are doing most of their teaching online now. Like, it's kind of become the thing. So the biggest challenge I face personally, which I think is also related to the challenge I see in people who I've worked with, mentored, taught, learned from, is, you know, how do we make this work in the complexity of the 21st century? And I feel like the coronavirus has kind of given us an opportunity to pause and really rethink a lot of things. Like I was talking with somebody about utility bills. It's like, so like, wait, why do we pay for water bills? Like, you know, like these kind of like fundamental things, you know, and I, you know, am fully integrated into that modern system, that financial system of like, you know, I have a mortgage, I have utility bills I pay, I have student loans. And so I have to somehow generate income to meet those things. And so I have to interface with this modern world. And rather than hate that, like, my challenge is to find a way to enjoy that and to make that worthwhile and still have time to do my practices while I'm a dad and while I, have to take care of my yard. And that's very similar to what I've seen in students. I do see that also in people I've worked with, that if they come to this a little bit later in life, to where I did, like, I think it's about 25 is often the age I see this, that if you come to these things after 25, there's sort of this, social conditioning we've all gone through, that the re-immersion into these things is more painful and it produces a lot more sadness and grief and pain. And so you have to find a way to let go of those things and to face those things and to, like, let them come out and find a healthy way to let them come out, rather than attack and blame other people or attack and blame society. Like, so there's something about that, our brains and our culture and our age around this too.
Yeah, no, that's a big one. Yeah, being able to be disillusioned in a healthy way, yeah. Free from illusion. When you mentioned kind of integrating with this society, I still, what I'm personally searching for is a way to, and I'm pretty close, I feel like. I don't know about the long-term picture yet, but finding that a baseline of that 15 to 20 hours a week of actual, that's how you meet your needs, and then finding ways to fulfill yourself or have a fulfilling life and contribute, some of those greater skills or greater needs around that. And for me, that's been it feels about right. It feels like, that's our old programming there. That's our old ancient patterning. We have a lot of momentum with that schedule. So I'm really trying to get back to that kind of Tim Ferriss's 4-hour work week, but maybe 20-hour work week. So, or month actually, isn't it? So.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's the desire my partner and my wife and I have with us and our family around that, and that's what we're working towards. And I did have a period of life where I was wrapped up more and more and more at the work level. When I was at Wilderness Awareness School, the last few years, I was more at the administrative level, and you spend less and less time in the field, and you're more and more on the computer, and you're more and more doing emails, and it just gets really stressful and really hard. And somebody has to do that work to have this amazing thing happening all the time. But it was not really, looking back on it, not really in alignment with the principles that I was teaching and that I want to live my life by, which is kind of ironic,
Sure. Yeah. It's an interesting interface. Yeah. Did I already ask you, what do you think people don't get about nature connection?
Well, I think it was about that it's somehow it was all hardship, but I do think the piece that maybe we didn't talk about is this, like, how simple it can be, right?
Yeah. How do you see this movement, or how do you see this kind of evolving? What do you see coming up next?
Well, there's some pretty interesting things happening around schools and education right now. And there's kind of this dual complexity of, like, there's a lot of schools that are happening online right now. And I'm talking about, like, sort of education for our kids, primary education. But there's also the talk of, like, making class size smaller, having more classes outdoors. I know there's some schools that are building outdoor classrooms in public schools in places like Detroit are building outdoor classrooms because they're realizing that there may be a long-term time where kids have to be further apart, that maybe the decision to put 30 kids in a classroom all together is not smart from a public health perspective, regardless of COVID, but that sociologically and psychologically, it's actually better for everybody if there's smaller class sizes. So there's kind of this interesting moment, and there's been a few people I've talked to, some of the people I interviewed in my book, some of the little bit older than me Indigenous men I've connected with, who we've all kind of looked at this world, this time with COVID, as like, is this like just a one-time thing, or is this the start of like several things that are going to happen that are going to fundamentally challenge the way we have our society designed? And they were referring to Indigenous prophecy around these kinds of things, and that there are these stories that if we don't learn to change our ways, that there are these things that are built into the earth or built into the creation, or like that, will activate and will start to change things for us. And so we may be, needing to do these things in a different way than we even realize. And maybe it's related to COVID, maybe it's related to global warming, maybe it's a series of things, Yeah.
Yeah. That's a big one.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to kind of wrap this up soon here, but do you have any final thoughts you think you want to include that are important to you?
Well, I do think that when we think about our friends and our families and our kids, that there's a way that we can all come together around these things. And we might have different political views or different worldviews about things than our extended families. But I've really found this really brings people together. And last summer I was doing some guiding work with this company, Evergreen Escapes. Pretty neat company in Seattle. They've been hit really hard with the pandemic, like basically shut down for the whole summer. But they guided, I was along with some other guides who got to guide trips to the Olympic Peninsula and Mount Rainier National Park and other places every day. People all over the world, would get thrown in a van together, 8 to 12 people on a trip, and then driven to these just like mind-blowingly gorgeous places with waterfalls and mountains. And by noon, like we would share a meal together. By like 1:30, everybody was like best friends, and it didn't matter. Like, there were people with very different backgrounds from me. I remember one family that was from Louisiana that were Catholic, that like I'm pretty sure was different politically and religious beliefs than I did. And we were just totally at peace and connected all through nature. And I met a lot of people from Texas that summer. They were all really wonderful people. And they were all like, I love national parks. I love nature. And we would all talk at the end of the day of like, how do we have nature connection at our home back where we were from? So I think this idea that nature and nature connection practices could be a real unifying factor for all of us and help us find a little bit more peaceful ways to discuss our differences and not be so combative is maybe something I would really encourage people to consider as a thing to take with them.
Love that. Yeah. It is, after all, the unifying factor,
It's the world we live in, right?
Yeah, there's no us and them in that world.
Yeah.
So what are you up to right now that you would like people to know about? Maybe along with that, what kind of resources do you recommend for people, and where can they find out more about Nate Summers?
Sure. Well, I have a website. It's www.primalnate.com. I actually like my website. It was designed by a friend of mine who's a former student who actually knows all about survival skills. So she's a designer, but survival skills instructor. So she's really great to work with. If anybody's looking for somebody like that,
Cool.
she's really gifted. Her name's Mink. I am technically on Instagram at Primal Nate, just one word, Primal Nate. I've been a little bit lax in my Instagram work recently because I like it in some ways and I don't like it in other ways. I'm figuring it out. But my big thing that I've been doing this summer is I've taught 2 courses. One was called Resilience, or it was a class on resilience, survival, and preparedness through the 8 Shields Institute. And that was a 10-week course that kind of happened right as COVID happened, about like how we can be all more resilient in our lives. And that's going to be available as a 10-week course people can do as the recorded version. That should be up and available sometime in September.
Cool.
And yeah, and then right now I'm doing a class with my wife Karen called Rewilding Our Bodies: The Art of Movement. And it's another 10-week series, and we've been doing a different thing each week, you know, doing animal forms and stick and stone training and qigong training, and so it's this comprehensive sampler of all these different related arts. And so that's another thing people can check out. That too will be available as a product at some point. People can check out my book Primal on Amazon or your independent bookstore. It was produced by Falcon Press. It's called Primal: Why We Long to Be Wild and Free. And Ben's in the book, so you can, you know, check it out.
Check it out. Yeah.
Yeah. And I just finished, or I'm mostly finished with the second book called Awakening Fire, which is a field guide to basically making fire and how to make fire in all sorts of different conditions and different species. And that'll be out in the springtime. And yeah, I think I'm kind of also in a little bit of a creative open space going into the fall of like, I've got some things lined up and I'm curious about what my next writing project might be. I've got some ideas. A wild food cookbook I've kind of done some tinkering around with. I might mess with self-publishing for the first time. And yeah, and Karen and I are probably going to offer another course this fall with 8 Shields that is probably going to be related to a lot of what we've been talking about today. These sort of like, we're calling it nourishing life. This idea of like, how can we live in harmony with the cycles of nature and food and herbs and medicines, and, you know, bring in a lot of the Chinese medicine training we both have. So that'll be up. That's enough about me. There's a lot of great resources out there. I do recommend John Young's work. You know, he's got so many great like audio resources. You can see them at 8 Shields. You can find his work on Amazon. Tom Brown's books are really good, especially his, you know, like his field guide series. I still go back to those field guides, especially when I was writing Awakening Fire. Like just his field guide to wilderness survival. It's just, there's so much in there. It's so rich and so dense. Thomas Elpel's work is a great resource. I got to talk with him some. And then Nicola Pellion is another person who's just doing really cool stuff, really powerful, inspirational female leader. You know, has been on the show Alone a few times. She has a couple books out. She has a great blog and email list you can get onto. So yeah, we're kind of living in a really rich time around these resources. And I would just say also, you know, all of the training I've seen that you do, Ben, like I'm, you know, super impressed and always excited about, and always kind of, you know, I learned from you about how you present your offerings a lot. Like I feel like I'm still figuring out like how exactly do I organize this and translate this for people. And I feel like how you've got it like blocked out, and the way you design it is really, really lovely. So yeah.
Oh, thank you for that. Yeah. Cool. Well, awesome, man. It's really nice to connect with you, and you know, just brought up, just realized how much cool stuff you're doing, and how many more conversations would really be interesting to have with you. So just want to thank you for your time, and maybe with you and your wife next time or something.
That
be
would
awesome.
be really great. I would love to get Karen on here. She has just a different perspective, a different language around these things, but has her own really great nature connection, and also just brings a more feminine energy to it that I think is really welcome to people. And when we teach, it's a really balanced thing. So yeah, I'll put that out to her.
Cool. Okay. Well, awesome, my friend. Thank you so much. And thank you folks for watching, and get out there and make some contact with yourself and with the earth. So, take
Yeah,
care, Nick.
thanks
Thank
everybody.
you. Okay.